All right, let's get into it. Something pretty interesting is happening in Japan, and it's blowing up online. A Japanese comedian, of all people, a guy named Mashida, has decided to get serious and explain this huge cultural shift he's seeing, this rapid rise in anti-immigration feelings, especially with younger people. So today, we're going to walk through his argument and see what it's all about.
So this really is the big question, right? It's kind of surprising. For the longest time, young people in Japan were seen as, not super into politics, maybe even a little apathetic. So what's going on? Why all of a sudden is this new conservative party with a Japanese first slogan just taking off with people in their 20s and 30s? Something's definitely shifting here.
And to really get a handle on it, we're going to stick with the comedian, Mashida. He actually says jokes aside to signal he's shifting gears from being funny to being serious. So we'll use his perspective as our roadmap for this whole explainer. Okay, first up, let's talk about the political party that's really at the center of this whole new vibe in Japan. It's called the Sansetto Party. Now, this Sansetto Party, it's not your grandparents' conservative party. It's new. And its message, Japanese first, pushing back against globalism, and wanting to totally rethink immigration, it's hitting a nerve, specifically with younger folks. According to Mashida, the core feeling here is a fear that Japan is kind of losing its unique identity because there's no real plan for immigration. So let's dig into the numbers for a second, because this is where things get interesting. You'll often hear this statistic thrown around. Only 3% of Japan's population is foreign. And yeah, from the outside looking in, that sounds tiny, right? You might think, what's the big deal? But Mashida argues that this percentage, well, it's pretty misleading. See, he says forget the percentage for a minute and look at the actual number. We're talking about almost 3.8 million people. In a country like Japan, which has been so homogenous for most of its history, that is not a small number at all. It's big enough that people are really starting to feel that things are changing, and changing fast. And this quote from him really gets to the heart of the fear. He says, that's not small, right? The worry isn't just about the number itself. It's about what that number could lead to. There's this growing concern, and you see it all over the internet in Japan, that if they don't get a handle on this, they could end up like some European countries where, in their view, the local culture has been watered down. Yeah, and this fear, it's not just coming out of nowhere. It's being fed by a constant stream of information. And, maybe some misinformation that's flooding in from other countries. Social media, as you can probably guess, is a massive driver here. You've got Japanese YouTubers, influencers, all sharing clips and stats about what's going on in places like the UK. And they're framing it as a warning, like, hey, look what happened there, we don't want that here. And here's a perfect example of the kind of stuff that's going viral. It's just a simple list of mayors in major UK cities, London, Birmingham, Oxford, and it points out that they're Muslim. This gets passed around as stone-cold proof that large-scale immigration can totally change a country's political leadership. And man, that kind of content is powerful. It really fuels the fear that the same thing could happen in Japan. But it's important to note that the comedian makes a big distinction here. He says the anxiety isn't really aimed at Westerners. He calls them comrades if they work hard and play by the rules. No, the real focus of the concern, he says, is on Chinese nationals, who are the biggest foreign group in Japan. And the worries there are totally different. They're geopolitical. People are worried about things like loose visa rules, huge numbers of properties being bought up, and the potential for political influence from China. So that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, the Japanese government's own policies. Mashida argues they're actually a huge part of the problem. Specifically, let's look at this thing called the Specified Skilled Worker Program. So look at this. It's the promise versus the reality. On paper, this program sounds great. It's supposed to bring in highly skilled people for creative, well-paying jobs. But what Mashida claims is actually happening is a total bait and switch. He says many of these workers end up in the worst-paying, hardest jobs, what he calls the 3D jobs: dirty, difficult, and dangerous. Worse, a lot of them show up already deep in debt to the people who brought them over, which he says is basically a form of modern slavery. So you have to ask, what happens when people are stuck in a situation like that? Well, they run. And the number is just, wow, almost 10,000 of these so-called skilled workers just vanished from their jobs in 1 year alone. And the fear is that because they're desperate to pay off their debts, some turn to crime. And of course, that just feeds right back into the negative narrative about foreigners. And then there's this really sharp contrast he brings up. Japan has this well-known issue of hikikomori, over 1 million of its own people who are so isolated they've totally withdrawn from society. So the comedian poses this really pointed question. Why is the government so focused on importing, in his words, cheap corporate slaves when it's not doing enough to help its own citizens who are struggling?
All right, next up, let's look at how certain government actions and media stories are basically just pouring gasoline on this whole fire of public fear. Okay, this hometown project is a perfect example of good intentions gone totally wrong. So a Japanese agency sets up what's supposed to be a simple cultural exchange with some African nations. But then media in Nigeria and Tanzania get it wrong and report it as some mass immigration plan with special visas. That false story goes viral back in Japan, and boom, protests. The goal was to build relationships, but instead it just created more suspicion. And then you've got this whole mess happening in Tokyo. The governor, Yuriko Koike, is in hot water over accusations that she made some kind of secret deal to bring in workers from Egypt, completely bypassing the city council. People are furious about the lack of transparency, accusing her of selling out Tokyo for her own gain. It's actually led to daily protests. So why bring up papakatsu? Well, the comedian makes a really clever and cynical point. The governor keeps insisting on calling the people from Egypt workers, not immigrants. He compares this to the term papakatsu, which is a nice-sounding euphemism for what is essentially sugar dating. His point is that the government is just playing word games to make a really controversial policy sound harmless. So, when you tie all these threads together, the new political party, the online fear, the broken policies, and the public anger, it all builds to one massive question about the future of Japan. And, after his videos took off, Mashida said he got tons of messages from people in places like the UK, Germany, and Canada. And they were all saying things like, Japan, learn from our mistakes before your culture disappears too. Now, whether those warnings are fair or not, they are incredibly powerful for his audience. It just reinforces this idea that Japan is standing at a cliff's edge. So if we boil his entire argument down to one thing, it's this. He claims this whole push for more immigration in Japan isn't about some noble idea of multiculturalism. Not at all. He frames it as something much more cynical, just a haphazard plan to get cheap labor for big companies and to line the pockets of a few politicians. And that leads him to his final, really provocative question. He puts the choice for Japan in incredibly stark terms. Is it better to rest in peace with a quiet, aging society, or rest in chaos with mass immigration? It's a heavy question, and it really sums up all the anxieties we've talked about today. It definitely leaves you wondering which path Japan is going to take. Thanks for joining me for this breakdown.